Here we are again, folks, in yet another wonderfully unhinged chapter of the history of the modern left, where empathy depends entirely on your political alignment. Now picture this, a major CEO gunned down in cold blood, and instead of universal condemnation, we get celebratory balloons from the so-called compassionate left. Forget irony, this is downright dystopian. And yet, we're told we're the problem for scratching our heads. The message is clear. Some deaths are tragic, others are vindicating. Welcome to the left's moral merry-go-round, where the sanctity of life gets swapped for applause as long as the right villain is on the chopping block. But here's the thing. My independent brain, yes, one that doesn't short-circuit when faced with nuance, sees the contradictions here plain as day. The clips we'll be looking at today, my friends, expose two realities. One where leftist activists peddle moral outrage as justice, and another where violence is justified as liberation when their guy swings the hammer. Whether it's ghoulish gloating over an executive's death or bizarre calls for vigilante tit-for-tat justice, the common thread is chaos. And don't get me wrong, our healthcare system is no golden child. But celebrating murder isn't reform, it's barbarism wrapped in bad hot takes. All that being said, let's start from the beginning. In enter Luigi Mangione, a former Ivy League high school valedictorian turned manifesto-toting, Unabomber-quoting tech whiz who decided the best way to fix the healthcare system in America was to pull a trigger on an unarmed CEO. You gotta hand it to him. For someone railing against parasites, he sure didn't mind living off his wealthy family's dime long enough to grow a grudge. A guy with all the privilege in the world who somehow convinced himself he's the victim of capitalism, crying foul because, wait for it, he had back pain. Newsflash, Luigi, half of America's spines feel like a pretzel, and most of us manage to endure it without going full villain monologue. Now, don't get me wrong, the healthcare system in America is a mess, but the idea that a deranged rich kid shooting his CEO is some kind of a Robin Hood moment, give me a break. If you're quoting Ted Kaczynski and thinking that's the blueprint for success, you might want to skip the reading list and seek a therapist. But hey, isn't it funny how the most radical anti-capitalists always seem to come from the cushiest backgrounds? Nothing says man of the people like a well-funded education, generational wealth, and a cousin in the state legislature. Luigi Mangione didn't rage against the machine. He just traded a bright future for a jail cell. Bravo, Luigi. You sure showed those parasites by becoming one. And just when you thought the story could get any worse, former Washington Post and New York Times journalist Taylor Lorenz decided to chime in. Let's just say her reaction to the murder was revealing. You're going to want to hear this one.
Aren't you supposed to be on the caring, sharing left where, you believe in the sanctity of life?
I do believe in the sanctity of life. And I think that's why I felt, along with so many other Americans, joy, unfortunately, because it feels like...
Serious?
I mean...
Joy at a man's execution?
Maybe not joy, but certainly not empathy. Because again,
we're watching the footage. How can this make you joyful? This guy's a husband, he's a father, and he's being gunned down in the middle of Manhattan. Why does that make you joyful?
Thousands of Americans that he murdered. So are the tens of thousands of Americans, innocent Americans, who died because greedy health insurance executives like this one push policies of denying care to the most vulnerable people. And the many millions of Americans that have watched people that I care about suffer and in some cases die because of lack of health care.
So should they all be killed then? Should they all be killed, these healthcare executives? Would that make you even more joyful?
No, that would not.
But why not?
And,
why are you laughing?
I think because it wouldn't fix the system.
You seem to find the whole thing hilarious.
I find your question funny.
A bloke's been murdered in the street. I don't find it funny at all.
I don't find it funny that tens of thousands of Americans die every year and because they are denied life-saving health care from people like the CEO. Now, I want to fix this system. You're right. We shouldn't be going around shooting each other with vigilante justice.
It's no surprise Taylor Lorenz manages to be both morally bankrupt and intellectually lazy. It starts with her admitting she felt joy at the execution of a husband and father. Joy, not outrage, not grief, but joy. Now, she immediately realizes how grotesque that sounds because Pierce didn't let it slide, and suddenly she's scrambling to clarify. It wasn't joy about the death itself, she insists, but joy that people were paying attention to the healthcare system. the classic "I misspoke" defense. Taylor's rhetorical lifeboat when her initial comment capsized under the weight of its own absurdity. Now, Taylor's pivot is as hollow as it is desperate. If her concern was really about systemic reform, why on earth would her first instinct be to smirk her way through the story of a man being shot in the street? That's not an argument. That's bad PR spin. And the fact that she laughed through her rebuttal, it's like watching someone step in quicksand and double down by flailing harder. Taylor, if you're going to preach about the sanctity of life, maybe start by applying that principle consistently instead of treating human death like a karmic plot twist in your personal vendetta against corporate America. Then comes the weak moral equivalence. Well, tens of thousands of Americans die because of greedy healthcare executives. Here she pulls the ends justify the means card, effectively suggesting that one man's murder is some sort of cosmic justice for systemic failures. Sorry, Taylor, but that's not how morality works. The sins of a system don't justify vigilante executions. If you think murder is acceptable as long as it targets someone you don't like, congratulations. You've just joined the ranks of every historical fanatic who wrongly thought violence could fix injustice. And let's be clear, neglect and failure aren't murder. Murder requires intent, someone pulling the trigger, making a choice. The healthcare system's flaws are tragic, but they're not the same as gunning someone down in cold blood. Taylor's language is pure emotional manipulation. By calling policy failures murder, she blurs the line to evoke outrage by dodging responsibility for her grotesque joy comment. It's lazy, dishonest, and cheapens real acts of violence. If you want to fix the system, fine, let's have that conversation. But celebrating a man's death while tossing around buzzwords isn't justice. It's barbarism wrapped in bad spin. And let's not forget Taylor conflating systemic issues with personal guilt. The death of one man doesn't suddenly solve healthcare. Just like burning down a hospital wouldn't magically cure disease. You can be angry, rightfully so, at the flaws in the system. But the moment you cheer someone being gunned down, you've lost any moral high ground you thought you had. To borrow Taylor's own words, it doesn't fix the system. Lastly, Taylor's attempt to reframe her joy as a vindication that the issue is finally getting attention is a pathetic reach. No serious conversation about healthcare reform begins with applauding death. The only thing getting attention here is Taylor Lorenz's lack of judgment. She doesn't look like a champion for change. She looks like someone who let her personal bitterness hijack her moral compass. If she really cared about the vulnerable, she'd recognize that celebrating violence, even rhetorically, only undermines her cause. So here's the truth. Taylor said exactly what she meant the first time, and the walk back only came when she realized how bad it sounded. That's not nuance, that's damage control. And when you're laughing your way through an argument about life and death, maybe, just maybe, you're not the one who should be lecturing the rest of us about compassion.
You're right. We shouldn't be going around shooting each other with vigilante justice. No. I think that it is a good thing that this murder has led to America, or really the media elites and politicians in this country paying attention to this issue for the first time. You mentioned you couldn't understand why somebody would feel this reaction when they watched a CEO die. It's because you have not dealt, it sounds like, with the American healthcare system in the way that millions of other Americans have.
I've dealt with the healthcare system in various ways in America. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but the idea that I would view it as something...
Have you been denied life-saving treatment?
The idea that I would view it as something joyful, that a man has been, who's just a healthcare executive, has been executed in the street, I find completely bizarre. Let me bring in Tommy here. Yeah. Tommy, you know, I keep being told... Hang on, Taylor, I'll come back to you.
Okay,
Tommy,
don't say I'm joyful. I said
you said you were feeling joyful.
Yeah, I take that back. Joyful is the wrong word, Piers.
You think?
But I said, as I clarified,
you think?
Yeah.
You think joyful is the wrong word? Yeah.
Sure.
I'd say it is.
Vindicated, celebratory, because again, it feels like justice in this system when somebody responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans suffers the same fate as those tens of thousands of Americans who he murdered.
Lorenz's position here is a masterclass in moral hedging, trying to have it both ways. She wants to distance herself from her extreme position after calling a murder joyful, while still justifying why she felt that way in the first place. When pressed, she concedes to the absurdity of her comment with, "Joyful is the wrong word," as if swapping out a single word will clean up the mess. But instead of truly retracting the sentiment, she doubles down with equally grotesque alternatives like vindicated and celebratory. That's not clarifying, that's just dressing up the same disturbing take in new language to make it sound less extreme. She justifies it by appealing to emotion, claiming that millions of Americans who suffered at the hands of the healthcare system would understand her reaction. Except there's a massive difference between being angry at systemic failure and cheering on vigilante justice. This isn't justice, as she calls it. It's a deranged act of violence that does nothing to solve the problem she's pretending to champion. Murdering one executive doesn't lower premiums, doesn't expand coverage, and certainly doesn't revive anyone who's died due to gaps in the system. All it does is leave a man dead, a family shattered, and Taylor Lorenz fumbling to frame it as a victory. This is a classic sleight of hand. She conflates systemic neglect with intentional, deliberate killing. Yes, healthcare failures have devastating consequences. People suffer, and that suffering demands reform. But calling those failures murder is not just dishonest, it's insulting to anyone who's lost someone to actual violence. A CEO making profit-driven decisions, however flawed or harmful, is not the same as pulling a trigger in broad daylight. Taylor knows this, but emotional buzzwords like murder are more convenient than a rational argument. Then there's her smug moral superiority. You can't understand because you haven't dealt with the healthcare system like millions of Americans have. Really? Piers Morgan and plenty of others can critique both the system and the act of gunning down an executive without having to flash their healthcare trauma credentials. Pretending that only those who've suffered are qualified to comment is a weak gatekeeping tactic. It's designed to shut down dissent while positioning herself as a spokesperson for the downtrodden. But here's the truth. You can be furious at healthcare injustice without losing your humanity. Millions of people are angry, and rightfully so, but most don't celebrate murder as some twisted form of karma. And let's not ignore the irony here. Taylor, who belongs to the same media elite she's railing against, suddenly positions herself as the voice of the people. Yet, when called out for her appalling take, her defense crumbles into, well, I didn't mean joyful, I meant celebratory. As if that's any better. Newsflash. Dressing up bad takes with new words doesn't make them less bad. Bottom line is, Lorenz's comments reveal a troubling mindset where violence is excusable as long as it targets the right person. It's not justice, it's barbarism dressed as virtue. And for someone who claims to care about fixing the system, her callous reaction undermines the very cause she pretends to champion. If you want real reform, you don't start by applauding cold-blooded murder. You start with moral clarity. And Taylor, you're fresh out of it. Anyway, while Lorenz spent the rest of the segment pulling a Bill Clinton, insisting it all depends on what the meaning of joy is, the left's reaction to the Daniel Penny acquittal tells a very different story. Suddenly, nuance and restraint are nowhere to be found, as outrage and moral absolutism takes center stage. Funny how the sanctity of life argument seems to shift depending on the perceived victim. And there's no greater example of this than New York City Council member Tiffany Caban, who posted on X, everything that led up to and followed the lynching of Jordan Neely on a New York City subway train by Daniel Penny could and should have been prevented. Jordan Neely deserved better than the violence of being denied access to stable housing and healthcare, and then dehumanized for it. Jordan Neely deserved better than the systems that allow for and justify extrajudicial white supremacist violence against black people. Now, it should be noted that this post is one of the most brutal community notes I've seen on a post in a while, fact-checking it to oblivion and essentially dismantling her argument along the way. The community note says, as part of a plea agreement with prosecutors after he punched a 67-year-old woman in the street in 2021, Jordan Neely was given free access to stable housing and health care at a treatment facility in the Bronx. He abandoned the facility after 13 days. Tiffany's statement is yet another masterclass in emotional grandstanding, completely untethered from reality. Let's start with her use of the word lynching to describe Daniel Penny's actions on a New York City subway. Lynching, by definition, refers to the deliberate, racially motivated killing of a person, usually by a mob, often to send a broader social message. It's a loaded word with a brutal history, one that Caban flings around irresponsibly here to provoke outrage. Facts be damned. What happened to Jordan Neely was a tragedy, yes, but framing it as a lynching is not just misleading. It's inflammatory rhetoric designed to turn a complex situation into a racial narrative with no room for nuance. Then there's her claim that Neely was a victim of a system that denied him stable housing and health care. Here's where the reality check comes in like a freight train. Neely was offered stable housing and health care after he punched a 67-year-old woman in the street in 2021, an incident that Caban conveniently omits. Neely was provided free access to a treatment facility in the Bronx as part of a plea agreement. And what happened? He left after 13 days. That's not systemic denial. That's a man deeply troubled and in need of help walking away from the support he was given. To ignore this fact in favor of a simplistic sob story isn't just dishonest, it's insulting to anyone actually trying to address the complexities of homelessness and mental health in America. Caban's final flourish that this tragedy represents extrajudicial white supremacist violence against black people is perhaps the most absurd of all. Let's break that down. Extrajudicial violence implies that Penny acted as a judge, jury, and executioner with racial intent, which is a bold accusation without evidence to back it up. Penny acted after Neely reportedly threatened passengers on a train. Witness testimony and video evidence show a chaotic and frightening situation, with Penny stepping in as others feared for their safety. Was it the right decision? That's for the courts to decide, and clearly they thought it was the right decision. But to slap a racial motive on it with zero proof is not just reckless, it's divisive and defamatory. What Caban is doing here is textbook emotional manipulation. She cherry picks the facts, ignores inconvenient details, and wraps it all in fiery buzzwords like lynching and white supremacist violence to push a narrative that collapses under scrutiny. This isn't about justice for Jordan Neely. It's about stoking outrage and using a tragic death to score political points. If Caban truly cared about preventing situations like this, she'd focus on the systemic failures surrounding mental health and public safety, issues that don't neatly fit into her preferred talking points. The reality is that Jordan Neely was failed by his own struggles, by a system that struggles to intervene effectively, and yes, by his own decisions to reject help. That's a tragic and complicated story that deserves thoughtful discussion, not performative outrage. Caban's statement doesn't offer solutions or insight. It offers hollow rhetoric, misdirection, and a refusal to confront the uncomfortable truths. If we're serious about fixing these problems, we need less grandstanding and a whole lot more honesty. And unfortunately, the last place we're going to find any of this is in the BLM movement, as you can see in the response from these leaders to the acquittal of Daniel Penny.
Just like everybody else has vigilantes, we need some black vigilantes.
That's right.
People want to jump up and choke us and kill us for being loud. How about we do the same when they attempt to oppress us?
Right.
I'm tired.
Tired.
I know you're looking for us to be like, oh, go and march. Go and march. No. This weekend, I want you to hold a community event everywhere from the Bronx to Houston to Seattle.
BLM leader Hawk Newsome's response to Daniel Penny's acquittal is, to put it mildly, unhinged. Let's start with a centerpiece of his argument. We need some black vigilantes. According to Newsome, the answer to perceived injustice is to embrace vigilantism. An eye for an eye, tit for tat violence. Forget solutions, forget reason, and forget the very principles of justice that movements like his claim to stand for. Instead, Newsome is calling for more chaos, as if meeting violence with violence has ever led to anything but more innocent people caught in the crossfire. Let's be clear, this isn't activism, it's incitement. Now, here's a problem with Newsome's logic. He frames Penny's actions as a deliberate act of oppression, saying, people want to jump up and choke us and kill us for being loud. That's not what happened. Penny didn't just decide to choke someone for speaking too loudly on the subway. Jordan Neely was reportedly behaving in a threatening manner, with witnesses describing a dangerous situation where passengers felt afraid for their safety. Newsome conveniently ignores this context because it undermines his entire narrative. The reality is this wasn't a racial targeting. It was a tense, chaotic moment that escalated tragically. Was Penny's response excessive? That's a question the courts weighed, and a jury, after considering the evidence, acquitted him. But to distort it as oppression or racial violence is dishonest and inflammatory. And let's talk about the word vigilante. Newsome throws it around like it's a badge of honor, as though forming rival groups to dispense street justice will somehow heal systemic wounds. Spoiler alert, it won't. Newsome's rhetoric doesn't advocate for change. It glorifies tribalism. It says, if they do it, we'll do it too. But here's the truth. Vigilantism doesn't discriminate. It spirals. And it creates a world where everyone is judge, jury, and executioner, and no one is safe. This isn't justice. It's lawlessness dressed up as revolution. It doesn't empower communities. It fractures them. Then there's the performative exhaustion. I'm tired. He's not tired of pushing bad ideas, though, just tired of people asking for rational solutions. Newsome mocks peaceful action, sneering at the idea of marching and saying, go in, march, go in, march. No. So what's the alternative, Hawk? More violence? Because historically, that has never ended well. Dr. King didn't build a legacy on encouraging black vigilantes. He built it on principles of justice, unity, and moral courage. Newsome's call to arms spits in the face of that legacy. Worse, it jeopardizes the very communities he claims to represent by encouraging confrontations over solutions. And finally, let's not ignore how dangerous and irresponsible this kind of rhetoric is. Telling people to embrace vigilantism is a reckless attempt to pour gasoline on a fire. It emboldens extremists, deepens divisions, and undermines real efforts to address issues like public safety and mental health. There are legitimate conversations to be had about race, policing, and justice in this country, but Hawk Newsome's solution of fighting back with vigilantes only guarantees more lives ruined and more tragedies to grieve. So here's the bottom line. What happened to Jordan Neely was tragic, but Newsome's answer is not justice. It's anarchy. He's not proposing a path forward. He's steering communities straight into a dead end. If you're tired, Hawk, then stop adding to the chaos and start offering solutions that actually help. Because what you're peddling isn't empowerment, it's destruction, and no one wins in this game. But it seems as though Hawk's tone and rhetoric isn't unique to him. Other BLM leaders are sharing in that.
Because to be real, they didn't even try. Once the lesser charge was removed, they came back an hour later and said it was deadlock. Less than an hour and 20 minutes later, they said not guilty. These wonderful white people, I hope they celebrate their Christmas while the Neely family is praying and asking God for comfort. Goddamn them and goddamn America.
Well, here we go again. Another BLM leader spewing inflammatory nonsense, this time claiming the jury in the Daniel Penny trial only reached their decision because, of course, they're white. Let's address the facts first, because facts, unlike rhetoric, don't care about the race of the jury. The prosecution, the ADA in this case, did everything in her power to secure a conviction. They even pulled one of the oldest tricks in the book, asking the judge to dismiss the bigger charge without telling the jury. Why? Because she hoped the jury, thinking they couldn't convict on the higher count, would feel pressured to compromise on the lesser charge. That's not justice. That's gamesmanship. Manipulating juries to hedge your odds of a guilty verdict is an insult to the justice system, plain and simple. And thankfully, this jury didn't fall for it. Now let's talk about this BLM leader's claim that the short deliberation somehow proves bias. First of all, the amount of time a jury spends deliberating doesn't dictate the quality of their decision. It's not a marathon where longer equals better. If the evidence isn't there, if the facts point in one clear direction, a quick decision isn't suspicious, it's responsible. The prosecution had their chance to make their case, and the jury clearly saw through it. Trying to smear these jurors as racially motivated isn't just disgusting, it's dangerous. It undermines faith in our justice system and further divides us along racial lines, all for the sake of a convenient narrative. But here's what's really going on. The BLM movement needs martyrs to keep its relevance. And when reality doesn't provide one, they're willing to distort the truth to create one. Let's be honest, Jordan Neely's life was tragic long before his death. His parents pretty much abandoned him. He had a documented history of mental illness, run-ins with the law, and violent behavior that put others at risk. Neely wasn't on that subway because of some systemic conspiracy. He was there because every safety net had failed. Or in some cases, he had been rejected. And where was the media? Where was BLM when he was alive suffering on the street? Nowhere. But the moment he died, suddenly everyone, his parents, activists, and media opportunists, rushed to claim him as a cause. Why? Because they needed his tragedy to fit their narrative. And let's not sugarcoat this. This is race baiting of the highest order. The BLM speaker knows that throwing around phrases like wonderful white people and damning America will stoke up outrage and division, because that's the playbook. It's easier to blame systemic racism than to have a hard conversation about mental health, personal accountability, and the failures of policies that let people like Jordan Jordan Neely slipped through the cracks. At the end of the day, this isn't about justice for Neely, it's about political theater. And let's not pretend that the facts of this case justify the outrage. Daniel Penny didn't walk onto the subway looking for trouble. He didn't choke Jordan Neely because he was loud, as they love to claim. Witnesses described Neely's behavior as threatening and erratic. Passengers feared for their safety. Penny stepped in to protect others, and the situation escalated tragically. Was it excessive? That's what the trial was for, and a jury, after hearing all the evidence, found Penny not guilty. That's how the system works. But because the verdict doesn't align with their preferred narrative, they scream racism and move the goalposts. So here's the bottom line. Weaponizing tragedies like this doesn't solve problems. It exploits them. BLM and its leaders don't want real solutions. They want outrage, because outrage keeps them in business. They'd rather make villains out of juries and heroes out of chaos than address the complex, uncomfortable realities at the heart of this case. And while they scream about justice, they're ignoring the fact that they're the ones turning human lives into props for their political agenda. It's dishonest, it's reckless, and it needs to stop. So what does this mean for you? It highlights a troubling pattern on the left, the exploitation of tragedy to fuel outrage and push divisive narratives regardless of facts or context. Whether it's Daniel Penny stepping in during a threatening subway situation or the cold-blooded murder of a CEO, the response isn't reasoned or measured, it's chaos. Hawk Newsome calls for vigilantes as if lawlessness is justice. And Taylor Lorenz calls a man's execution joyful before scrambling to walk it back. The left has become far too comfortable twisting human suffering into political theater, selectively applying outrage only when it fits their agenda. Where were these voices when Jordan Neely was alive and struggling on the streets? Why is violence suddenly excusable when it targets the right villain? The answer is simple. Outrage is their currency, and they'll spend it recklessly to stay relevant. If you care about real solutions and not moral posturing, it's time to see through the noise. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.